There are journeys in life that have nothing to do with distance. They are not measured in miles or hours, but in the subtle, seismic shifts that occur within the private geography of the heart. You can travel across the world and remain perfectly still, or you can sit on a morning train, moving through a landscape you have memorized, and find yourself crossing into an entirely new country. I learned this on the 6:17 a.m. express, in the quiet space between one city and the next. It was a journey I had engineered to put an ocean between my heart and Julian. But every rumble of the wheels on the track, every pane of glass that reflected our twin silhouettes, only ever brought me closer to him. It was on that train, in the anonymous hum of the carriage and the shared warmth of a winter coat, that I discovered you can run from a person for years, only to find that all you have been doing is circling back to the one place you were always meant to be. He was asleep on my shoulder. This was not a new development, but a ritual that had become the axis around which my world now turned. His head, heavy with a trust one felt I had done nothing to earn and everything to betray, rested in the hollow between my collarbone and neck. His breathing was a slow, even tied against my skin, a rhythm that had become more familiar to me than my own heartbeat. I could feel the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, something with sandalwood and maybe citrus, a fragrance that clung to the fabric of my coat long after he was gone. His dark hair, usually a controlled chaos of waves, was soft against my cheek. I held my breath, a practice I had perfected over weeks of these shared commutes, trying to become a statue, a pillar of unmoving stillness, terrified that the slightest twitch, the slightest exhale, would wake him and shatter the fragile bubble of this borrowed intimacy. The window beside us was a sheet of black, streaked with the silver tears of a persistent November drizzle. Inside, the train was a warm, golden capsule, hurtling through the pre-dawn darkness. Most of our fellow passengers were lost in their own worlds, faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their phones, or slumped in sleep, just as Julian was. But no one was sleeping like him. No one was leaning on another person with such complete, boneless surrender. It was a surrender I coveted and feared in equal measure. This, right here, was the reason I had taken the job in the first place. To escape this exact feeling, the agonizing proximity to something I could never truly have. And yet, here it was, amplified, delivered to me each morning with the quiet fidelity of a sunrise. To understand the weight of his head on my shoulder, you would have to understand the decade of careful distance I had cultivated. Julian and I met in college. We were assigned as freshman roommates by an algorithm that, in its cold, binary logic, managed to produce a stroke of accidental genius. He arrived a day before me, his side of the room already a testament to his personality, a vibrant, chaotic landscape of lacrosse sticks, half-unpacked boxes of programming textbooks, and a speaker already pumping out some indie band I had never heard of. He was all bright energy and easy smiles, a whirlwind of casual confidence that felt utterly alien to my own quieter, more observational nature. I walked in with my 2 suitcases and a box of photography equipment, feeling like a shadow creeping into a sunlit room. He turned, saw me hesitating in the doorway, and his face split into a grin that seemed to light up the entire cramped space. He bounded over, hand outstretched, and introduced himself with a warmth that felt less like a greeting and more like an unconditional welcome. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, tectonic plate of loneliness sliding into a new and warmer place. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee and terrible pizza, in the shared misery of 8 a.m. lectures, and the easy camaraderie of wasting afternoons away talking about everything and nothing. He was the outgoing one, the one who knew everyone, who could charm his way into any party and out of any trouble. I was the quiet one, the observer, the one who saw the world through the frame of a viewfinder. I documented our college years through my lens, and Julian was, invariably, my favorite subject. Not in a posed, formal way, but in the candid, unguarded moments that truly defined him. Julian, laughing so hard he had to brace himself against a wall. Julian, brow furrowed in concentration, sketching out lines of code on a whiteboard, a language as foreign to me as ancient runes. Julian, standing on the lacrosse field, drenched in rain, his face a mask of fierce determination. I had thousands of pictures of him, a secret archive of the boy who became the man who became my best friend. And through the silent, one-way conversation of my camera, I fell in love with him. It was a slow, creeping realization, not a sudden thunderbolt. It was the way my stomach would tighten when he walked into a room. It was the way I found myself memorizing the cadence of his voice, the specific way he would run a hand through his hair when he was frustrated. It was the hollow ache in my chest when he would talk about a girl he was dating, a succession of bright, pretty young women who were all, in their own ways, perfectly wrong for him. I learned early on to build a fortress around that feeling. Our friendship was too precious, too essential to my own sense of stability, to risk it on the flimsy hope that he might ever see me as anything more. So I became the perfect friend, the confidant, the steadfast, reliable, always there Leo. I listened to his relationship woes, offered advice I felt hypocritical for giving, and smiled through the introductions to new girlfriends, each smile feeling like a small tear in my own soul. I buried my feelings so deep they became a part of my geology, a bedrock of longing over which the landscape of my life was built. He never knew. He was so open, so emotionally transparent in his own way, that the idea of someone harboring such a profound, long-held secret was likely beyond his comprehension. To him, I was just Leo, his best friend, his anchor, and for a long time, I convinced myself that was enough. After we graduated, we rented a 2-bedroom apartment together on the edge of the city. It was a natural, unspoken decision. The thought of not living with him felt like a physical amputation. He got a demanding job as a software consultant, which involved a lot of travel and high-stakes projects. I began to make a name for myself as a freelance photographer, specializing in architectural and fine art photography. Our lives were different, but they orbited each other. We fell into a domestic rhythm that was both comforting and excruciating. I would wake to the sound of his shower, the smell of his coffee brewing. We would cross paths in the hallway in the morning, him already dressed in a crisp shirt, me still in my pajamas. Some nights he would come home late, exhausted and frayed, and collapse onto the couch, and I would bring him a beer and listen to him vent about his clients. It was in these quiet, domestic moments that the walls of my fortress felt most besieged. Seeing his tie slung over a dining chair, his shoes kicked off by the door. These small, intimate signs of a shared life were a constant, painful reminder of the line I could not cross. He would bring girls home, and I would make myself scarce, retreating to my room, the dark room, or just out into the city, walking for miles until the ache in my chest subsided to a dull, familiar thrum. The last one was Sarah. She was a graphic designer he met through work. She was smart, funny, and ambitious, and for a while, I thought this might be it. I watched him with her, saw a different kind of seriousness in his eyes. He talked about her in a way that was less about the thrill of a new romance and more about the quiet comfort of a potential future. I braced myself for the inevitable conversation, the one where he would tell me he and Sarah were moving in together, and I would have to find a new place to live, a new way to exist without the constant, low-level hum of his presence in my life. I rehearsed my supportive, happy-for-you speech in my head 100 times, but the conversation never came. Instead, the arguments started. I would hear them through the thin walls of our apartment, hushed, tense voices escalating into sharp, painful bursts. It was always the same theme: his work, his travel, his emotional unavailability. "It's like you're here, but you're not, Julian," I heard her say one night, her voice strained with tears. "It's like a part of you is always somewhere else or walled off. I can't reach you." I sat in my room, my camera cold in my hands, and felt a terrible, shameful flicker of something that wasn't sympathy. It was recognition. I knew that walled-off part of him. I had spent years photographing its perimeter, studying its defenses. Sarah was seeing the same thing I had seen for a decade, but she was trying to scale the walls, while I had simply learned to live in their shadow. The end, when it came, was not a fiery explosion but a quiet, sad implosion. He came home one Tuesday evening with a cardboard box containing the few things he had kept at her apartment. He did not say a word. He just walked into the living room, set the box down on the floor, and sank into the armchair, staring at nothing. His face, usually so animated, was a blank mask of exhaustion. The vibrant energy that was so intrinsically him was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow stillness. That was the catalyst. That was the shift. The breakup with Sarah, combined with an incredibly stressful project at work, seemed to break something in him. The easy, confident facade crumbled, and underneath was a man I barely recognized, someone lost and deeply, achingly lonely. He stopped going out. He stopped calling his other friends. He just existed. He would come home from work, shed his suit jacket like a heavy skin, and drift through the apartment like a ghost. He started to orbit me, not in our old, easy way, but with a new, unspoken need. He would sit in the kitchen while I cooked, not talking, just watching my hands as I chopped vegetables. He would linger in the doorway of my darkroom, enveloped in the chemical-scented darkness, and just stand there, as if the silence was a balm. I became his only point of contact with the world, the only person whose presence he seemed able to tolerate. And I, in my role as the steadfast friend, let him. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I just made space for his silent grief, for his exhaustion, for whatever it was he was going through. It was around this time that the opportunity for the new job came up. A prestigious gallery in a city 2 hours away by train offered me a position as their in-house curator and photographer. It was a dream job, the kind of career move that could define my future. A year earlier, I would have jumped at it without a second thought. But now, the thought of leaving him in this fragile, broken state, felt like an act of profound cruelty. We were sitting on the couch one night, the television on but muted, the only light coming from a single lamp that cast long shadows across the room. He was staring into the middle distance, a beer untouched on the coaster beside him. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and heavy. "I got a job offer," I said, my voice quiet in the stillness. He turned his head slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on me. "Yeah. In Kingston," I said. As a curator at the Hepworth Gallery, a flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe something else I couldn't name. "Wow, Leo. That's huge. That's amazing." His voice was genuine, but it was thin, lacking its usual resonant warmth. "I'm thinking of taking it," I said, watching him carefully. I was testing the waters, looking for a sign, any sign, that he needed me to stay. A part of me, the selfish, hopeful part, wanted him to say, "Don't go," but he didn't. He nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "You should," he said. "Of course you should. It's what you've been working for." He looked away, back at the blank television screen. "It'll be quiet here without you," and that was it. Permission granted. A blessing, of a sort. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the right thing for my career. More than that, it was a chance for me to finally, truly, escape. To put real, physical distance between us. To break the cycle of my own secret longing. To maybe, finally, start to heal. I told myself it was for the best for both of us. He needed to find his own footing again, and I needed to stop being his crutch, his silent keeper. I needed to build a life where my happiness wasn't contingent on the crumbs of affection he unknowingly dropped. So I took the job. I accepted the offer and signed the contract, feeling a strange, hollow mixture of triumph and grief. I was finally getting away. I found a small apartment in Kingston, but kept my room at our old place, planning to commute for the first few months until I was fully settled. The commute was long, but the 6:17 a.m. express was direct and fast. It gave me time to read, to think, to decompress. For the first 2 weeks, it worked. The distance was clean. I would see Julian on the weekends when I came back to the city, and our interactions were brief, friendly, and blessedly superficial. I could feel the old patterns of my obsession starting to loosen their grip. I was breathing easier. I was sleeping better. I felt a fragile, tentative shoot of hope that I could actually do this, that I could redefine our friendship into something manageable, something that didn't constantly threaten to break my heart. Then, on a Monday morning in late October, as I was settling into my usual window seat on the train, I saw a familiar figure hurrying down the platform. It was Julian, dressed in his consultant's uniform of a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase. My heart did a slow, painful lurch. He boarded the carriage, his eyes scanning the seats, and then he saw me. A look of genuine surprise, followed by a relieved smile, washed over his tired features. "Leo," he said, making his way towards me. "What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing." I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is my train." "To work, right?" he said, a hand going to the back of his neck. "Of course. My firm just landed a new client. A big one. Their headquarters are in Kingston. I'm going to be out there 3 or 4 days a week for the foreseeable future." He gave me a weary, almost apologetic smile. "Looks like we're commute buddies." And just like that, my carefully constructed escape route became a shared path. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. My plan to get away from him had failed spectacularly. He slid into the seat beside me, in the space that I had begun to claim as my own. This quiet, solitary capsule of transit was suddenly, irrevocably, ours. The first few times, it was almost normal. We talked. He told me about the new project, the pressure he was under. He looked better than he had in weeks, the challenge of a new, demanding client seeming to reignite some of his old fire. But he was still exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were permanent fixtures. The train would pull out of the station, the city lights would give way to the dark countryside, and our conversation would slowly taper off. He would lean his head against the cool glass of the window, his eyes closing. I would pretend to read my book, all too aware of his presence beside me, of the inches of space that separated his shoulder from mine, a space that felt charged with a strange, humming electricity. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a week or so into our new routine. He had been up late the night before, working on a presentation. He was barely coherent when he sat down next to me, mumbling a greeting before slumping in his seat. The train had barely cleared the city limits when his head, which had been lolling against the window, dipped forward and then, as if pulled by a gravitational force I couldn't comprehend, it tilted sideways. It came to rest, gently, on my shoulder. Time stopped. My breath caught in my throat. Every nerve ending in my body went on high alert. I was acutely aware of the weight of his head, the warmth of it seeping through the fabric of my jacket and shirt. I could feel the soft tickle of his hair against my neck. My first instinct was to flinch, to pull away, to create the distance I had trained myself to maintain for a decade. It would have been the normal thing to do, the friendly thing, to gently nudge him and tell him he had fallen asleep on me. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a warring flood of emotions. Terror that this was a mistake, that he would wake up and be embarrassed, and a deep, illicit, overwhelming joy. It was the single most intimate physical contact we had ever shared, and it was happening under the guise of an accident, an unconscious act of exhaustion. So I did nothing. I sat there, rigid as stone, for the entire hour-and-a-half journey to Kingston. I didn't read my book. I didn't look at my phone. I just stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in front of me, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I focused on the rhythm of his breathing, the slow, steady rise and fall that I could feel through my shoulder, my chest. It was a metronome counting out the seconds of this stolen closeness. When the train began to slow for its approach into Kingston Station, a surge of panic went through me. I had to wake him. I gently cleared my throat, and then, my voice barely a whisper, I said his name. "Julian, we're here." He stirred, a low groan rumbling in his chest. He lifted his head, blinking in the sudden brightness of the station lights. He looked around, disoriented for a moment, and then he looked at me. There was a beat of silence where I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. He knew he had been sleeping on me. I braced myself for the apology, for the awkward laugh, for the moment he would create distance between us again. But it didn't come. Instead, he just looked at me, his gaze soft and unfocused with sleep. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice thick and gravelly. And that was all. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, gathered his briefcase, and stood up. "Coffee before we head to our respective prisons?" he asked, a shadow of his old grin returning to his face. And we walked off the train together, as if nothing had happened, as if my entire world hadn't just been rearranged on its axis. That first time established the precedent. It created a new, unspoken permission. The next day, he sat beside me, and within 20 minutes, his head was on my shoulder again. This time, it felt less like an accident and more like an inevitability. He settled in with a small sigh, a sound of release, as if this was a comfort he had been craving. The ritual had begun. For mornings a week, Julian would fall asleep on my shoulder. I learned the subtle nuances of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes twitched in the early stages, his fingers flexing against his thigh. I learned that when he was deeply asleep, his mouth would fall slightly open. I learned the exact moment to wake him, just as the train crossed the river on the outskirts of Kingston, giving him enough time to gather himself before we arrived. My life became a study in contrasts. By day, I was the capable, professional curator, discussing acquisitions, planning exhibitions, living the life I had ostensibly chosen. But my mornings were a secret, sacred, agonizing ritual. That train carriage became a bubble outside of time, a liminal space where the rules of our friendship were suspended. I became an expert in stillness, in breath control. I would sit for an hour and a half, a living piece of furniture, a willing pillow, just to feel the weight of him, the warmth of him. It was a form of self-torture, I knew. Each morning was a fresh dose of a poison I was addicted to. It was a reminder of everything I wanted and couldn't have. But it was also the only time I felt truly close to him, in a way that words and conversations had never allowed. He was giving me a part of himself he gave to no one else, his unguarded, unconscious self. He was trusting me with his vulnerability, and I treasured it like a holy relic. I tried to rationalize it. He was exhausted. I was a convenient, familiar presence. It was purely platonic. A friend leaning on a friend. I repeated these phrases to myself like a mantra, but they were flimsy shields against the truth. The truth was in the way my hand yearned to reach up and smooth his hair. The truth was in the way I would close my eyes and just absorb the sensation of his presence, trying to burn the memory of it into my skin. The truth was that these stolen moments were becoming the most important part of my day. I started to dread the weekends, the days I didn't have the commute, the days I didn't see him. The distance I had so desperately sought was now a punishment. He never spoke of it. Not once. We would get off the train, grab coffee, and go our separate ways. In the evenings, we often took the same train back, but he rarely slept on the return journey. He would be energized, or at least wired, from his day, and we would talk about work, about colleagues, about dinner plans. The morning ritual existed in its own sealed-off reality, a dream we tacitly agreed not to acknowledge in the waking world. This plausible deniability was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed the intimacy to continue, but it also left me in a state of perpetual uncertainty. What did it mean? Did it mean anything at all? Or was I, as I had done for a decade, just projecting my own feelings onto his innocent, unconscious actions? I was a photographer, a professional observer, trained to find meaning in light and shadow, in composition and form. And I was now applying that same obsessive analysis to every breath Julian took, every millimeter he shifted against my shoulder. I was trying to develop a photograph in a darkroom with no chemicals, hoping an image would magically appear. The tension kept building, a slow, steady pressure inside me. I felt like a geological fault line, absorbing stress that would inevitably lead to a quake. The ritual became more entrenched. Some mornings, he would get on the train, give me a tired smile, and lean his head on my shoulder almost immediately, without the pretense of trying to stay awake first. It was an expectation now, a given. He was no longer just falling asleep on me. He was choosing to. The unspoken nature of it was deafening. He was using my body for comfort, for rest, and I was letting him, because I was a fool, and because a part of me, a desperate, hopeful part, believed it was more than just convenience. It felt like a confession he was making in his sleep, a confession he was too afraid to make when he was awake. One Thursday evening in deep winter, the inevitable happened. A snowstorm, which had been threatening all day, hit the region with a sudden ferocity. Our evening train was delayed, then delayed again. We ended up leaving Kingston 3 hours late, crawling through a landscape that had been transformed into a maelstrom of white. The carriage was cold and sparsely populated. The heating system was struggling against the icy drafts seeping through the window seals. Julian was shivering, chafing his hands together. He hadn't worn a heavy enough coat, ever the optimist when it came to weather forecasts. I was wearing a thick wool sweater under my jacket. "Here," I said, shrugging off my outer jacket. "You're freezing." "No, Leo, I'm fine," he protested, but his teeth were chattering. "Don't be an idiot," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. I draped the heavy coat over his shoulders. He pulled it around himself, his hands disappearing into the sleeves. He looked small and weary. He mumbled a thank you and huddled into the warmth of the coat, my coat, which smelled of me, of my apartment, of the chemicals from my darkroom. The train lurched forward and then stopped again, stuck behind another delayed service. The lights flickered, casting the carriage in an eerie, pulsing twilight. "Looks like we're going to be here a while," Julian said, his voice muffled by the collar of my jacket. He was looking out the window, at the hypnotic swirl of snow. The world outside was a formless, chaotic blur. Inside, our small space felt intensely quiet, intensely still. He was tired. I could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He turned from the window and looked at me. His eyes were dark and deep in the low light. He didn't say anything. He just held my gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he leaned over and rested his head on my shoulder. This was different. This wasn't the morning ritual. He was awake. He was conscious. This was a deliberate choice, made in the cold, quiet intimacy of a stalled train in a snowstorm. My heart hammered. This was it. The fault line was shifting. I could feel the ground giving way beneath me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, feeling the familiar weight, but this time it was charged with a new, terrifying, thrilling significance. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were open. I could feel his eyelashes flutter against my neck. He let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that seemed to carry all the exhaustion and loneliness of the past few months. "Leo," he whispered, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the train's emergency power. "Yeah," I managed to say, my own voice a strained whisper. He was silent for another long moment. I could feel the tension in him, in the corded muscle of his neck resting against me. He was wrestling with something. Then he lifted his head. He didn't pull away. He just lifted his face so he could look at me. Our faces were inches apart. I could see the faint dusting of snowflakes caught in his eyelashes. I could see the uncertainty, the fear, and something else, a raw, undisguised vulnerability that mirrored my own. "Would it be okay?" he asked. His voice was fragile, a thread of sound in the immense silence. I knew what he was asking. It wasn't a question that required clarification. It was the question I had been simultaneously dreading and dreaming of for 10 years. It hung in the air between us, shimmering and terrifying. And in that moment, all the years of self-denial, of careful fortress building, of sensible, rational self-preservation, they all crumbled into dust. All that was left was the truth, raw and undeniable. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the permission he needed. He leaned in, closing the final inch of space between us. His lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, movie scene kiss. It was tentative. It was questioning. It was unbelievably soft. It was just the gentle pressure of his mouth against mine, a moment of profound, terrifying, beautiful stillness. It tasted of cold air and coffee and an apology. It was a confession. It was a question and an answer all at once. It lasted for only a few seconds, and then he pulled back, his eyes searching mine, his face a canvas of apprehension. He was waiting for me to run, to push him away, to tell him he had made a terrible mistake. But I didn't. I just looked at him, at this man I had loved in silence for so long, and I felt a decade of tension release from my body in a single, shuddering exhale. I reached up, my hand trembling slightly, and cupped his cheek. His skin was cold. He leaned into my touch, his eyes fluttering shut, a look of immense relief on his face. And then I was the one who leaned in, and I kissed him again, a little more firmly this time, a little more surely. It was a kiss that said, "Yes, it's okay. Me too." We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the snowstorm raging outside our bubble, the train carriage our silent, unwitting witness. We didn't talk. There were no words for what had just happened. We just sat in the quiet, in the shared warmth of my coat, his head eventually finding its way back to my shoulder. But this time his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. His touch was no longer an accident, no longer a question. It was a statement. I looked down at our joined hands, at the way his fingers fit so perfectly between mine, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost hurt. The journey, I thought, was over. I had arrived. I was wrong. The journey wasn't over. It had just entered its most treacherous territory. The train eventually started moving again, and we arrived in the city hours late, stepping out into a world blanketed in a surreal, muffling silence. The snow had softened all the sharp edges of the city, turning it into a dreamscape. We shared a taxi back to the apartment, a journey spent in a charged, electric silence. He still held my hand, his thumb stroking the back of mine, a small, repetitive gesture that sent shockwaves through my entire system. When we got to our apartment door, he finally let go. He hesitated, his key in the lock. "Leo, He started, then stopped. He wouldn't look at me. I'm really tired, me too," I said softly. He nodded, still not meeting my eyes, and unlocked the door. He went straight to his room and closed the door behind him. I stood alone in the hallway, the sound of his lock clicking shut echoing in the silence. The warmth of the kiss, the solidness of his hand in mine, it all began to evaporate, replaced by a creeping, familiar cold. The door was closed. The line had been drawn again. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up. There was a note on the kitchen counter. Had to go in early. "See you tonight." His handwriting was a tense, hurried scrawl. There was no mention of the train, no mention of the kiss. It was as if it had never happened. I went to Kingston on my own train, the seat beside me unnervingly empty. The weight I had grown so accustomed to was gone, and its absence was a physical ache. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety, replaying the kiss, the look in his eyes, the feel of his hand, and then the sound of his door locking. I had misinterpreted everything. Of course I had. He was vulnerable. He was lonely. The storm, the intimacy of the moment. I was just a port in the storm, a convenient comfort. I had been a fool to think it meant more. The shame was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. He wasn't on the evening train. When I got back to the apartment, it was dark and empty. My phone buzzed with a text from him. "Sorry, got held up. Pulling an all-nighter at the office, another excuse. Another retreat." The pattern continued for the rest of the week. He found reasons not to take the train with me. He left early, he stayed late. We were back to being two ships passing in the night. Only now the space between us was filled not with comfortable silence, but with the deafening roar of everything that had been done and then immediately undone. The pain of it was sharper than the years of simple longing had ever been. To be given a glimpse of that country, to be allowed to cross the border for a single, breathtaking moment, only to have my passport revoked and be unceremoniously deported, was a cruelty I hadn't known was possible. The anger came slowly, a quiet burn beneath the hurt and confusion. I had spent a decade being patient. I had spent a decade respecting his boundaries, protecting our friendship at the cost of my own happiness. But he was the one who had crossed the line. He was the one who had asked the question, who had initiated the kiss. And now he was retreating into a cowardly silence, leaving me to grapple with the emotional wreckage alone. He didn't get to do that. He didn't get to open that door and then slam it in my face without a single word of explanation. My role as the quiet, passive observer was over. I had to know. Even if the answer was what I feared, I had to hear it from him. The ambiguity was no longer a space I could live in. I waited for him. On Saturday afternoon, I knew he would have to come home. I sat in the living room, the same room where he had collapsed after his breakup with Sarah, and I waited. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the gray afternoon gloom, the silence of the apartment amplifying the anxious thumping of my own heart. I heard his key in the lock, the soft click of the door opening and closing. He walked into the living room and stopped short when he saw me sitting there in the dark. "Leo," he said, his voice wary. "I didn't know you were here. Where else would I be?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's my home." He flinched at my tone. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there, a silhouette against the brighter light of the hallway. "Look, I know I've been distant," he started, the words sounding rehearsed. "This project has been killing me. I've just been swamped." "Stop," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his excuses like a knife. Don't lie to me, Julian. Not about this." He was silent. He dropped his briefcase by the door with a soft thud. He ran a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture of frustration, of being cornered. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice low. "I want you to talk to me," I said, my own voice starting to shake, despite my resolve. "You kissed me. You held my hand. You looked at me like, and then you disappeared. You locked your door. You ran. You owe me an explanation. You don't get to just run away." He sank onto the arm of the couch, his head in his hands. He looked utterly defeated. "I messed up," he mumbled into his palms. I was confused. It was the storm. I was tired. I wasn't thinking straight. "I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I never should have. I don't want to ruin our friendship. It's the most important thing in the world to me." There it was. The speech I knew was coming. The classic, cowardly retreat. It didn't mean anything. Let's just forget it happened. Let's go back to how things were. And every word was a fresh stab of pain. Because I couldn't go back. He had shown me what was on the other side of the wall, and I couldn't unsee it. I stood up, the anger finally boiling over, hot and cleansing. "Our friendship," I said, my voice rising. "You think that's what this is about? Preserving our friendship? What friendship, Julian? The one where I spend 10 years loving you in secret? The one where I watch you date a dozen women and pretend it doesn't tear me apart? The one where I let you use me as your personal sedative on the train every morning because it's the only way I can be close to you? That friendship? Is that the one you're so desperate to save?" The words tumbled out of me, a decade of silence breaking in a torrent. The confession I had never intended to make was suddenly filling the space between us, raw and undeniable. He lifted his head, his face stricken. He looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. The confusion in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. 10 years, he whispered. I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Yeah, 10 years. Since the day I walked into that dorm room. So don't you dare talk to me about ruining our friendship. You have no idea what that friendship has cost me. But I was willing to pay it. I was fine with it. But then you had to go and kiss me. You had to go and give me hope. And then you took it away. So just be honest with me. For once. Was it all just a mistake? Was I just convenient? Just tell me the truth so I can finally let you go." I was breathing heavily, the silence in the room ringing in my ears. My heart was pounding. I had laid it all bare. All my cards were on the table. It was his move. He stared at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. He looked from my eyes, to the floor, to the window, as if searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. We were locked in this moment, in this room, with the wreckage of my confession between us. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "Leo, I swear to God, I never knew." "Of course you didn't," I said, the anger draining away, leaving me feeling empty and exhausted. "I made sure you didn't." He stood up and took a hesitant step towards me, then another. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could see the tremor in his hands. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time, I saw not confusion, not pity, but a profound, gut-wrenching fear. He was terrified. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "The kiss. It wasn't a mistake. That's why I ran. Because it wasn't a mistake. And that scared the hell out of me." He was crying. Silent tears were tracking down his face, catching in the stubble on his cheeks. I had seen Julian angry, frustrated, happy, sad. But in all the years I had known him, I had never once seen him cry like this. Not even after the breakup with Sarah. This was something different. This was the sound of his own walls coming down. I don't understand what's happening to me, he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. After Sarah, I felt so empty, just hollow. And the only time I didn't feel that way, the only time my head was quiet, was when I was with you. On the train. I started taking that train just to be near you. I told myself it was for work, but it was a lie. I just wanted to be near you. And falling asleep on you. It was the only real rest I've had in months. It felt safe. He took a shuddering breath, trying to regain control. And then in the storm, when I kissed you, it wasn't about being confused. It was the opposite. It was the first thing that has felt real, that has felt right, in so long. And it terrified me, because it wasn't a feeling I recognized. It wasn't like anything I've ever felt for anyone else. It was more, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I ran. I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared. He stood there, utterly broken and completely open. The confident, easygoing Julian I had known for a decade was gone, and in his place was this man, raw and vulnerable, and admitting that his feelings for me were real. All my anger, all my hurt, it dissolved in the face of his painful, honest confession. He hadn't been using me. He had been finding his way to me, in the only way he knew how, and had gotten scared at the destination. I closed the small distance between us and wrapped my arms around him. He collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, that same spot where he had slept so many times, and he sobbed. A deep, racking sound of fear and relief in a decade of unspoken, unrecognized truth finally coming to the surface. I held him, my own tears falling silently into his hair, and just let him break. I held him until the shaking subsided, until his breathing evened out, until the only sound in the room was the quiet rhythm of our two hearts, finally beating in the same time. We didn't fix everything in that one conversation. A decade of hidden feelings and a lifetime of self-perception don't get rewired overnight. But we had finally started talking. We spent the rest of that weekend in the quiet sanctuary of the apartment, just talking. He told me about the profound loneliness he had felt for years, a loneliness that even his relationships couldn't touch. He talked about how my presence had always been a quiet anchor in his life, something he had taken for granted until it was almost gone. And I talked, really talked, for the first time, about what it was like to love someone from the other side of a wall. I told him about the photographs, the secret archive of my affection. The next Monday morning, we walked to the station together. It felt different. The tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative tenderness. We got on the train and sat in our usual seats. The train pulled out of the station, the city lights beginning to recede. He didn't lean his head on my shoulder. Instead, he reached over and took my hand. He just held it, his fingers laced with mine, resting on his lap, out in the open for anyone to see. He looked at me, a small, shy smile on his face. I don't think I'll be sleeping much on this commute anymore, he said softly. I don't want to miss any of it, and he didn't. Our journeys to Kingston became a new kind of ritual. They were filled with quiet conversation, with shared silence that was no longer ambiguous but comfortable. They were filled with small, public acts of affection, a hand on a knee, a head that rested on my shoulder for a moment, not in sleep, but in a simple, conscious gesture of closeness. He was learning a new language, and I was learning to trust that he meant what he said. The door to his room was no longer locked. More often than not, it was left wide open. And more often than not, we found our way to the same bed, not for sex, not yet, but for the simple, profound comfort of sleeping next to each other, of knowing the other person was there in the dark. It was a slow, gentle process of healing, of learning to be new people with each other. I never thought a commute, a journey designed for separation, could become a bridge. I had tried to run away from the geography of my own heart, only to find that all roads, or in this case, all railway lines, led back to him. The journey wasn't about getting from one city to another. It was about closing the distance between two people who had been standing side by side for years, separated by nothing more than a wall of fear and silence. We had crossed over. We were in that new country together now. And as I sat beside him on the 6:17 a.m. express, his hand warm in mine, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that I was finally home.